Most people think a man sitting alone in a quiet house is lonely, but what if that's the first time in his life he's actually at peace? Michael Carter is 68 years old, and if you saw him on a Sunday morning sitting by his kitchen window with a cup of black coffee, no noise, no interruptions, no one asking anything from him, you might think something is missing from his life, but you'd be wrong because for the first time in decades, nothing is pulling at him, nothing is draining him. Nothing is demanding that he explain himself or adjust who he is just to keep things calm, and that silence most people fear has become something else entirely for him, something steady, something earned, something he protects without apology, because what people don't see is the version of Michael that existed before this, the one who believed that love meant effort, that staying meant loyalty, that sacrificing his own peace was just part of being a good man, and for years he played that role without question, showing up, giving more, asking for less, convincing himself that if he just tried a little harder, things would eventually feel right, but they didn't, and that's the part nobody talks about, because what looks like a man choosing to be alone is often a man who finally understood the cost of not being alone, and once that realization settles in, everything changes in a way most people around him will never fully understand. There was a time when Michael did not sit in silence like this. A time when his calendar was full, his phone never stopped buzzing, and his life revolved around people who always seemed to need something from him, because back then he believed that being needed was the same as being valued. And he built his identity around showing up, fixing problems, and holding everything together even when it quietly wore him down. And at 35, he would have looked at a quiet house and called it emptiness. He would have said that a man without a relationship was missing something essential, something that made life meaningful. Because at that age, he still believed that love was supposed to fill every gap and justify every sacrifice. But time has a way of changing what feels important and what feels expensive. And by the time he reached his 60s, Michael was no longer asking whether something looked good on the outside. He was asking a different question entirely, one that most younger men are not ready to ask. Does this actually make my life better, or does it quietly take more than it gives? And once that question became real for him, once it stopped being theoretical and started being something he measured in his own energy, his own stress, his own sense of calm at the end of the day, the answers began to shift in a way that could not be undone, because he had lived long enough to see patterns repeat, promises fade, and effort go unreturned. And what replaced hope was not bitterness. It was clarity. The kind of clarity that makes a man pause before inviting anything or anyone back into a life he has finally learned how to stabilize on his own. What most people never see is how the exhaustion builds, not in one dramatic moment, but in 1,000 small ones that slowly drain a man without ever announcing themselves. And Michael remembers those moments clearly now, not as isolated events, but as a pattern that repeated itself across years. Conversations that felt like negotiations, evenings that ended with more tension than peace, situations where he found himself explaining the same boundaries over and over again as if clarity alone should have been enough. And each time he adjusted, compromised, or stayed quiet just to keep things from escalating, he told himself it was normal, that relationships required work, that patience would eventually be rewarded, but what he did not realize at the time was that the work was not building anything stable. It was simply maintaining something that constantly needed to be repaired. And that distinction is what changed everything for him later on. Because there's a difference between investing in something that grows and investing in something that only survives as long as you keep pouring energy into it. And once Michael began to recognize that difference, he also began to notice something else. How he felt when he was alone compared to how he felt when he was not. And the contrast was impossible to ignore. The quiet was not empty. It was restorative. It was the only place where his mind settled instead of bracing for the next misunderstanding or expectation. And that realization was not sudden. It unfolded slowly until it became undeniable that what he had once called connection had often come at the expense of his own stability. And once a man sees that clearly, he cannot unsee it. And he does not rush back into anything that risks taking it away again. The moment that changed everything for Michael did not look dramatic from the outside. There was no shouting, no final argument, no clear breaking point that anyone else could point to and say that was it. It was something much quieter, something almost easy to miss if you're not the one living it. It happened on an ordinary evening when he found himself sitting across from Linda Brooks, listening to a conversation that felt strangely familiar, not because of what was being said, but because of how it made him feel, that subtle tightening in his chest, that quiet sense that no matter how carefully he chose his words, he would still have to explain himself again, adjust again, smooth things over again. And in that moment, something shifted, not emotionally, but mentally, like a switch flipping from hope to recognition, because he realized he had been in this exact emotional position before, not just once, but many times with different faces and slightly different stories, but always the same underlying pattern. And what unsettled him was not the situation itself. It was the clarity that came with it, the understanding that this was not a misunderstanding that would resolve itself. It was a dynamic that would repeat itself. And for the first time, he did not feel the urge to fix it. He did not feel responsible for making it better. He simply observed it. And that observation created distance. And that distance created something he had not felt in years, a sense of choice. And once a man realizes that he has a choice, that staying is not an obligation but a decision, it becomes impossible to ignore the cost of that decision. And in that quiet realization, without any announcement, Michael stopped negotiating against his own peace. What surprised Michael the most was not how much he had given over the years. It was how different life felt once he stopped giving it away so easily. Because for the first time in decades, his time belonged entirely to him. His mornings were no longer shaped by someone else's mood. His evenings were no longer influenced by unspoken expectations. And the quiet routines he once overlooked began to take on a kind of meaning he had never noticed. Before, a slow breakfast without tension, a walk without checking his phone, a night where nothing needed to be resolved or managed. And at first it felt unfamiliar, almost too still, like something was missing, but that feeling did not last, because what replaced it was something far more stable, a sense of control over his own pace, his own space, and his own state of mind. And that is when he understood something most people only realize much later, that freedom is not about doing more. It is about not having to constantly recover from things that drain you. And once that realization settled in, the idea of re-entering a dynamic that could disrupt that balance no longer felt appealing. It felt expensive, because he had already lived a version of life where his peace depended on someone else's behavior. And he had already seen how fragile that kind of peace really is. So now, when he thought about connection, he did not think about excitement or companionship first. He thought about stability and whether anything new could exist in his life without quietly taking that away. And that question alone filtered out more than most people would ever expect. There is a truth Michael came to understand that most people are not comfortable admitting, and it is this: not every relationship is built on genuine connection. Some are built on expectation, on roles, on an unspoken agreement that you will show up as a version of yourself that makes the other person feel secure. And for years he accepted that without questioning it. He adapted, he softened certain edges, he held back certain thoughts. He carried the weight of being consistent, dependable, and emotionally available even when he did not have much left to give. And at the time he called it love, he called it commitment, he called it doing the right thing. But looking back, he sees it differently now, because what he was really doing was performing, maintaining a version of himself that fit the relationship rather than expressing who he actually was. And that realization did not make him angry. It made him honest. Because once a man recognizes that he has been performing for acceptance, he starts to question how much of that acceptance was ever truly for him, and not just for the role he played. And this is where everything shifts, because Michael no longer wants to be needed in that way. He no longer wants to be valued for how much he can tolerate or how well he can adjust. He wants something far simpler and far rarer: to exist without constant negotiation, to speak without filtering every word, to move through his day without anticipating emotional reactions he has to manage. And when you have experienced that level of ease, even briefly, it becomes very difficult to return to anything that feels like a performance again. What Michael wants now is not complicated, but it is very specific. And that is why so few people truly understand it, because it does not look like what most people are chasing. He is not looking for intensity. He is not looking for constant attention. And he is certainly not looking for someone to fill a space. He has already learned how to live comfortably within. What he wants is something that does not compete with the life he has built, something that fits into it without disrupting its rhythm, without turning calm into confusion or clarity into doubt. And that standard changes everything, because it means that connection is no longer about how strong the feeling is at the beginning. It is about how stable everything remains over time. It is about whether he can sit in the same quiet he now values and still feel at ease with another person beside him, without pressure, without expectation, without the subtle tension that used to follow him even in moments that were supposed to feel close. And this is where most people misunderstand men like Michael. They assume he has closed himself off, that he has lost interest. But the truth is much more precise than that. He has not lost interest in connection. He has lost tolerance for anything that disturbs his internal balance. And once a man reaches that point, his standards are no longer shaped by loneliness or desire. They're shaped by experience. And experience does not negotiate the way hope once did. It filters, it observes, and it quietly walks away from anything that feels even slightly misaligned with the peace he worked so hard to create. What becomes clear at this stage of Michael's life is something most people are not ready to accept, that not all connections are worth preserving. And more importantly, not all feelings deserve to be followed, because for years he believed that if something felt strong, it must be meaningful. If something felt intense, it must be real. But experience taught him a different lesson, that intensity can exist without stability, and closeness can exist without respect for one's peace. And once he saw that pattern clearly, he stopped confusing emotional pull with genuine alignment. And that shift changed the way he evaluated everything. Because now he does not ask how much he feels, he asks how much it costs him to feel it. And that question alone eliminates most of what once seemed attractive, because he has learned that anything which constantly disrupts his sense of calm, even in subtle ways, eventually demands more than it gives. And that is a price he no longer pays without thinking. And this is the part that often gets misunderstood, because from the outside it looks like withdrawal, like distance, like a man stepping away from connection. But internally it is something much more intentional. It is selection. It is refinement. It is the result of decades of trial, error, and quiet observation, finally leading to a standard that cannot be lowered again. And once a man reaches that level of clarity, he does not chase, he does not convince. And he certainly does not compromise the one thing he knows he cannot easily rebuild if he loses it: his peace. At this point in his life, Michael no longer measures fulfillment by who is beside him. He measures it by how he feels within himself when no one else is there. And that is a standard that took him decades to understand, because for most of his life he was taught to look outward for meaning, to build something with someone, to maintain it, to protect it, even when it quietly took more from him than it ever gave back. But now the direction has reversed. Now everything begins internally, and anything external must align with that, or it simply does not belong. And this is where the real shift happens, not in his circumstances, but in his priorities, because he is no longer trying to avoid being alone. He's trying to avoid losing what he has finally built, a life that feels steady, predictable in the best way, free from emotional turbulence, and grounded in something that does not depend on another person's consistency. And when you reach that point, the idea of bringing someone into that space is no longer about hope. It is about compatibility at the deepest level, not shared interests, not attraction, but shared respect for peace, shared understanding of boundaries, shared ability to exist without creating unnecessary friction. And if that is not present, the absence of a relationship does not feel like a loss. It feels like protection, because what most people fear is loneliness. Michael has come to recognize as something entirely different. It is clarity. It is ownership. It is the quiet confidence of a man who finally knows that his life does not need to be filled to be complete.